Hey, what's going on all you Soulfisters? It's been a while since the last guide I made, and we've gone through some big changes, so I thought an update was due. This will be focused on the Energy Overflow build, of course, and since we got a nice express event to 1370, I will also be including some tips for all those new people who have gained some interest in our wonderful class. So why should you make a Soulfist, you may wonder? Well, there's only one real reason why anyone makes a Soulfist.
I want to go fast.
Yes, that's right, you want to go fast. I believe we're the only class that can hit the cooldown cap at 80%. This means we have absolutely no downtime in our rotation. We got top tier DPS. Our damage is so good that in the latest patch in Korea we are currently scheduled to get roughly a 3% nerf in damage. Now, is this enough to affect us? Nah, we still good. Now usually with these classes that run high swiftness, mana becomes a big issue. Luckily for us, our class engraving is all about keeping our resource low, with the added benefit of it never running out. Now, what are the downsides? Well, for one, we don't see big numbers. You probably hear about Igniter Sorks or Deathblades bragging about their 100 million crit or whatever they get that happens once in a blue moon. My biggest crit? 3 million. Now it's actually 3 million 10 times, and I do that about every 10 seconds, and that's only 1 out of my 5 skills that hit hard. But we don't get the satisfaction of seeing that single huge number. We lack super armor. Most melee classes have level 1 super armor on their attacks, so when bosses do little AoEs, their attacks don't get cancelled. Unfortunately for Soulfist, we are considered a mid-ranged class, so depending on your skill setup, 2 or 3 of your skills will not have any super armor. This means if you get hit at all while trying to cast these skills, it gets cancelled and goes on cooldown. Last, it is painful and scaled down content. I absolutely refuse to do challenge guardians on my Soulfist because it's just so painful after experiencing it at high levels. You lose all of your swiftness, and your cooldowns are so high it's miserable playing as a T1 or T2 Soulfist again. As a final word on something people like to say about Soulfist, I disagree with people saying Soulfist is a bad alt because it requires a high investment. I don't really believe in any class being high investment. Every class sucks if you don't put any work into it, and every class feels great when you put the work in. I have 7 different T3 classes, and all of them felt like shit until I spent a little gold on engravings and some decent accessories. As soon as I put in the gold, they all felt vastly better. Soulfist is no different. Don't think about how long the investment takes to pay you back. It's a game, and you invest in a character to have more fun on them so it doesn't feel like work making the gold back. Let's talk about combat stat distribution real quick. The main build that you'll see most people run is full swiftness with crit on the necklace. The other build that is a little less common is running 1 ring or earring with crit while everything else is swift. Both builds work just fine, and depending on which you run will make certain engravings better than the others. Now you may be wondering, is there a thing as too much swiftness? How do we reach the cooldown cap that I was talking about before? Now, if we look here, we see that the cooldown cap is at 80%. Let's see how much swiftness you need to reach that. With relic gear, you should be able to attain around 1650 swiftness. This gives 35%, add in 18% from the relic set, and 25% from hype 3, and we're already at 78%. Considering we reached the cap on attack speed and movement speed with the support relic set, there is almost no reason to go above this number. Now of course this is only when we are in hype 3, and if you do continue to push swiftness past 1650, you will still see benefits in hype 2 and below, but you won't see any benefit in hype 3. My endgame plan is to have about 1600 swiftness and 800 crit to maximize the effectiveness. With engravings, your core 3 engravings should be Adrenaline, Grudge, and Energy Overflow. Some people will max Energy Overflow, and others will say it's worthless and leave it at level 1. My opinion on the matter is it's cheap and easy to get level 3 energy overflow, and 15% more damage is still better than most engravings out there. To anyone who says they have a hard time keeping their energy under 300 for the damage boost, you should probably reroll, because with how low our cooldowns get, it just means you didn't want to go that fast. With the last 2 engravings, it will depend on what combat stats you chose. Full Swiftness builds will want Mass Increase and Raid Captain as their 4th and 5th engravings. If you followed my videos for a while, you would know I'm a long time non-believer in Raid Captain, and I still hold true to that until we got Vykas. With Vykas, supports are finally able to make their 4-piece Yearning Relic set, which gives the party an additional 8% attack and move speed. This is the final piece of the puzzle as to why every Korean player used Raid Captain, because it pushes us from the mid-20s in movement speed to the mid-30s, making Raid Captain very efficient. Under 1445 pre-relic gear though, other engravings are still much better. Also because of this support buff, especially as the full Swift build, you will be over the attack speed cap when in hype, which is why you want to use Mass Increase over something like Curse Stall. Now, what if you're running the crit build? Instead of Mass Increase, you replace it with Keen Blunt Weapon as your 4th. I recommend this build at 1370 because it slaps a lot harder with all of the crit you get from the Argos set. With Relic Gear, you lose a lot of that crit rate, and what I am running personally is about 1350 Swift and 800 crit. This gives me 30% base, 15% from Adrenaline, and the 7% card set, so I'm still sitting at a comfortable 52% crit rate. As a 5th engraving, you could either go Mass Increase or Raid Captain. You will feel the negatives a little from Mass Increase in this build, and you don't quite have enough Swiftness to really make Raid Captain efficient. Once we obtain bracelets and ancient accessories though, this build won't have those problems anymore. I simply would not recommend running Curse Stall because Mass Increase gives more attack power, and when running full Swift, since you are over the cap, you won't even notice the negatives to it. Plus running Grudge and Curse Stall together is just a recipe for death when running the tougher Legion raids. With the recent balance patch, most of our skills remain the same, but the biggest winner of all was definitely Energy Blast. We have 7 core skills that everyone agrees upon are pretty solid. We have 2 self buffs, Flash Step and Energy Release. We have our counter and party synergy skill in Bolting Crash. Then our 4 main DPS abilities in Force Orb, Energy Blast, Merciless Pummel, and Heavenly Squash. The last skill to round out your rotation will either be Shadowbreaker or Crippling Barrier. Both skills have their pros and cons to them, and depending on the fight, one may be more useful than the other. I did the full test here, and just so people don't complain, yes, they do have even gems and tripod levels. Crippling Barrier does scale better than Shadowbreaker in terms of damage. Shadowbreaker, on the other hand, has a tripod that will boost its damage to be higher than single tapping Crippling Barrier when the boss is under 50%. Both have roughly the same amount of stagger and the same cooldown with tripods, but Shadowbreaker gives you a second destruction skill, while Crippling Barrier gives you super armor. I myself stick with Shadowbreaker because it's nice to have a second destruction skill for things like Valtan or Ice Turtle. In the future, when tripods are easier to change, I would definitely switch between the 2 skills depending on the fight. Not much to talk about when it comes to tripods. Always take the tripod that has the bigger damage number, with the only exception being Energy Blast. With Energy Blast, the difference of how long it takes to use the skill with Ferocious Strike, which is about 1 second, versus Barrage of Blows, which takes almost 4 seconds, the less damage is very worth the time saved. If there are no damage choices, get the tripod that will lower the cooldown. If it doesn't have either of those, you probably shouldn't be using that skill. If you were to set a priority on which tripods to aim for first, definitely look out for Energy Release and Flash Step tripods. Increasing the power of your self buffs in return will increase the damage of all of your skills. While Merciless Pummel and Energy Blast will be your 2 hardest hitters, don't sleep on the other tripods. With their lower cooldowns, they do respectable damage as well. This is probably why people call Soulfist a high investment class due to all of your tripods being useful, and honestly, necessary. When people ask me about runes, I always just say if you don't know what rune to use Galewind. A couple of good suggestions though are have quick recharge on Flash Step and Rage on Energy Release. Bleed should always be on a spammable skill in either Force Orb or Bolting Crash, and if you're using Conviction and Judgment, all of our skills are multi-hit, so it's up to you where you're comfortable of putting them. There are a few viable relic sets for Soulfist, but I'm sure most high-end players will agree that the Dominion Fang set is the absolute best. With the extra 18% cooldown reduction, this is what turns Soulfist from a good class to an absolute beast. Now, while the Dominion set may be considered best in slot, don't count out the other sets as well. I will be making a video in the future showcasing all of the DPS of the different relic sets. Now, what makes Soulfist so good with the Dominion set? Well, we're the only class that can keep a 100% uptime on it without using the Awakening engraving. I won't go into a lot of depth on this, but you should keep in mind the various ways that you can reach 50% cooldown reduction, which is necessary to maintain the buff. It's important to have this buff up all of the time because not only will you be losing 18% CDR, but you are also losing out on over 40% damage when you let the buff drop. It's basically a 2-minute long mini Hype 3 buff. Now remember, these are bare minimum amounts of swiftness that you need. Always aim for more so you don't drop the buff when you recast. You can do this with as little as 1200 swiftness in Hype 3. The next amount of swiftness needed would be 1400 with Hype 2 and Judgment. At 1650 swiftness, you can use Hype 1 and Judgment. And in the future, you can even do something like 1400 swiftness, Hype 2, and Awakening 1. I know after one of my previous videos, everyone was telling me that Judgment works, so I included it in here. The only problem I have with it is it's hard to rely on it because of timing issues. 90% of the time, I will awaken in Hype 3. But once in a blue moon, when cooldowns align, I'll notice that I can get Judgment up when it's time to awaken. But it's another timer to keep track of, and I'm way too lazy for that. Now for a quick tip for you tryhard gamers out there on being able to start the fight with the buff and not having to use Hype at all. Just get your Awakening engraving to Epic, which should be cheap, and equip Awakening in both your equip slots at the repair circle before a fight. This will give you 50% CDR from the engraving so you can start the fight with the buff. Don't forget to switch back your engravings before you start though. I myself am way too lazy to do this, especially when you are wiping a lot. Since we're on the topic of min-maxing, I'll go ahead and talk about this other tip that is way too tryhard for me as well. If you absolutely hate waiting the 4 seconds it takes to cast your Awakening, it is possible to animation cancel it by opening your pet window and going into any of the menus. If you want to save the 2 seconds, cool, but I'd rather just take the damage. Now, if you want to be a little unique and you loved having good crit rate, here's another build you can try out. 4-piece Hallucination and 2-piece Dominion. With this set, you still get the 18% cooldown and 10% damage from Dominion, but with the Hallucination set, you will also be getting 15% crit rate and 13% damage. This is for you people who just can't let go of losing the crit from the Argo set. The total trade-off for getting the 50% crit rate is roughly 17% damage, which may sound bad, but because of your higher crit rate, your Keen Blunt engraving becomes more effective, making the gap a little smaller. The other downside is you have less Awakening charges, so if a fight lasts longer than 10 minutes, you won't be able to refresh your Dominion buff unless you run the Awakening engraving. Now, how do you play this class? I know we love to go fast, but think of it more as a calculated fast. Contrary to popular belief, you should not be mindlessly spamming skills. Every attack skill you use should be used during one of your 2 self buffs. These are 3 and 6 second windows where you'll be fitting in as many skills as you can. Your damage is basically a choke if used outside of these buffs. Also, because your attack speed and cooldown changes as you go through different hype levels, there really isn't a set rotation, or you may be able to fit in less skills during a buff when you have no hype up. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching through this long and probably boring video. As always, leave comments below if you have any additional questions because I'm sure I missed something. I'm also looking to see if there's any interest in a PvP guide for Soulfist. I have a feeling the PvP season will end in a couple of months, meaning rewards will be coming out soon. I'm not going to say I'm the best PvPer, but I am sitting in high plat and I could probably guide some of y'all in the right direction.